Hi, everyone. All right. It's story time, which means get comfy, cozy. I'm on my couch, and I think it's important to be comfortable when you're reading a book. It just helps you concentrate and enjoy the experience a lot more. So, we're going to be reading Who is Sonia Sotomayor? And this is a really great book. So you can listen and follow along with your copy. Um, Otherwise, you can just sit back and listen to me read. All right, let's open it up. Page number 1. Who is Sonia Sotomayor? New York City, May 25th, 2009. It was a warm spring day, the kind of day to be outside. But Sonia Sotomayor was in her office, sitting beside her phone. She was waiting for the most important call of her life, a call from the president. A call from the White House. She would learn whether President Barack Obama wanted her to be a judge on the Supreme Court. Sonia was already a judge. Her courtroom was in downtown New York City. But being one of the 9 judges on the Supreme Court would be very different. The Supreme Court is the most important court in the country. It decides whether laws in the United States are fair or not. Its decisions are final. All day, the phone in her office rang again and again. Each time Sonia picked it up, it was her family calling. They wanted to know what was happening. If she got the job, she would be I need my glasses. Sorry. If she got the job, she would be only the 3rd woman to sit on the Supreme Court and the very first Hispanic person. Her family would be invited to go to the White House with her the next day. Some family members were coming from Puerto Rico. Finally, at 7 o'clock that evening, Sonia couldn't stand waiting any longer. She picked up the phone and called the White House herself. She spoke to an aide to the president. What should she do? If she was picked, she had to get to Washington by the next morning. The aide told Sonia to go home and pack and wait for a call. Then, a little after 8 p.m., the call came. The one she so hoped for. It was the president. He told her he would name her to be the next Associate Justice on the Supreme Court. Sonia choked up and started to cry. "Thank you, Mr. President," she said. Then she asked her to promise 2 things. He wanted her to stay the same person that she was and to always stay connected to the world she had come from. For Sonia Sotomayor, a girl who had grown up poor and proud of her Puerto Rican heritage, that was a promise she was very happy to make. Latino and Hispanic. What is the difference between the terms Latino and Hispanic? A boy or man whose family comes from Latin America is called Latino. A girl or woman whose family comes from Latin America is Latina. Hispanic refers to someone whose family comes from a Spanish-speaking place, like Spain, Mexico, or Puerto Rico. So a person like Sonia Sotomayor, whose family comes from Puerto Rico, could be called Hispanic and Latina. Chapter 1, born in the Bronx. And there you can see a map. And the Bronx is in the upper right-hand corner. Sonia Maria Sotomayor was born on June 25th, 1954. Her parents, Juan and Selena, brought her home. They lived in a poor area of the Bronx, which is part of New York City. Like many of their neighbors, Juan and Selena had come to the United States from Puerto Rico. They had each left Puerto Rico in 1944, hoping for a better life in the Bronx. They met and married. They moved into the building where Juan's mother lived. The Sotomayors worked hard to make a life in their new country. Selena worked at a hospital while she studied to become a nurse. Juan worked in a factory. Selena learned some English, but the family spoke only Spanish at home. When Sonia was 3 years old, her brother Juan was born. The family called him Junior. With the family growing, her parents decided to move to a bigger, nicer apartment in the Bronx. Sonia liked her new home, but missed living near her grandmother Mercedes. Years later, Sonia wrote a book about her life. She called it My Beloved World, and it was published in 2013. In the book, she wrote about her grandmother, how full of life she was. She gave parties for the family almost every Saturday night. Everyone danced, played dominoes, and sang. Mercedes read poetry about Puerto Rico and cooked large meals. The apartment would fill with the smell of Puerto Rican food like chicken cooked with onions and garlic. Even as a child, Sonia liked pig's feet and pig's ears. When Sonia was very young, Mercedes began taking her to Puerto Rico for vacations. Sonia loved those trips. She never forgot the clear blue water of the ocean and the white sandy beaches of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is an island in the Atlantic Ocean. It is about 1,000 miles from Florida. The name Puerto Rico means rich port in Spanish. The island was owned by Spain for 405 years. That is why Spanish is the main language. But ever since 1898, Puerto Rico has been a part of the United States. And there you can see it on the map. Although Puerto Rico is not a state, everyone in Puerto Rico is an American citizen. But Puerto Ricans do not have all the rights of U.S. citizens. They can't vote for Congress members or the presidents. Some Puerto Ricans wish their country would become the 51st state. Others want Puerto Rico to be an independent nation, not part of the United States. Sonia Sotomayor has thought a lot about this question over the years, but it is tricky to decide. Sonia's father was a sweet man. He took Sonia on picnics to the beach and to Yankees games. But he drank too much. Her parents fought a lot because of this. When Sonia's father lost his job, Selena worked nights and weekends to support the family. She also worked to pay for Sonia and Junior to go to a Catholic school. Selena thought education was the most important thing in the world. But Sonia didn't like her school. It was called Blessed Sacrament. The nuns were very strict. They slapped kids who didn't behave. Sonia had other troubles as well. When she was almost 8 years old, she fainted in church. Sonia often had no energy. She was thirsty all the time. She was losing weight. Selena took Sonia to the doctor right away. The doctor sent Sonia to Prospect Hospital in the Bronx for some tests. Selena worked at Prospect Hospital, so Sonia wasn't afraid at first. But when the tests were done, the doctor had bad news. Sonia had type 1 diabetes. Sonia had never seen her mother cry until that moment. Diabetes then and now. People with diabetes have too much sugar in their blood. Their bodies can't get rid of the sugar. There is a medicine that keeps the sugar at a safe level. It is called insulin. Insulin is given through injections. The problem is that sugar levels can change very quickly. So people with diabetes have to test their blood all day long. They have to carry insulin with them all the time to give themselves shots. In the early 1960s, when Sonia was young, it was much harder to control diabetes. Many diabetics did not live as long as people without the disease. Today, however, the treatment has improved. People like Sonia live much longer and lead active lives. Sonia was scared. She had to stay in the hospital for a week. When she got home from the hospital, Sonia felt better. But there was another problem. As Sonia explained in her book, her parents were nervous about giving her insulin shots. Selena was a nurse, but she hated the idea of hurting Sonia. Her parents started fighting about it. Sonia was always a girl who wanted to solve problems herself. So she climbed up a chair near the stove to boil water for sterilizing the needle. Sterilizing means getting rid of germs. At first, her mother was worried. Should she really let a young girl use the stove and handle a needle? Nearly all parents would say absolutely not. But Selena decided to trust her child. From that day on, Sonia gave herself shots of insulin every day. But the very next year, her world changed again. Her father died suddenly of a heart attack. He was only 42 years old. Sonia and Junior were very sad, but their mother seemed overcome by grief. Years later, Sonia wrote that her mother wouldn't come out of the room at night. How was a 9-year-old girl supposed to have a happy childhood with so much misery around her? Chapter 2, High School Hopes and Dreams. Sonia was lonely all that summer with nothing much to do. She turned to books. She spent hours reading in the library. Her favorite books were Nancy Drew mysteries. I love those books. Sonia loved how Nancy Drew could solve crimes and catch bad guys. Sonia knew that she might not live very long. Still, she thought a lot about the future. She was determined to make the most of the time she had. She wanted an important career. Maybe she could solve crimes like Nancy Drew or Perry Mason. Perry Mason was a hit TV show when Sonia was young. It was about a clever lawyer who defended innocent people accused of murder. Every week, Perry Mason would win a case in court. If she wanted to be a lawyer one day, Sonia knew she'd have to study hard and get good grades. Her mother had taught Sonia the importance of learning. Even though they were poor, Selena bought a set of encyclopedias for their home. The thick, leather-bound books were the kind that most people saw in libraries. People only saw in libraries. Sonia paged through a different volume each day, learning as much as she could. School became easier after Sonia's father died. The nuns were kinder to Sonia now, and Selena started speaking English at home. That helped a lot. Sonia also learned that asking for help was a great way to succeed. One day, she asked one of the smartest girls to help in school for help. The girl gave Sonia some study tips. After that, Sonia got better grades. By the time Sonia was ready to start high school, her Bronx neighborhood had become a rough place. It was full of drug dealers and gangs. So Selena moved the family to a safer part of the Bronx. Their new apartment was near Cardinal Spellman High School. That's where Sonia started 9th grade. When Sonia was first at Cardinal Spellman, the girls and boys did not have classes together. They only saw one another at lunch. Still, Sonia made plenty of friends. She also had a boyfriend named Kevin Newman. Kevin had blue-gray eyes and curly light brown hair. He was smart and interesting. He made Sonia feel special. On their first date, Kevin took Sonia to a fancy part of Manhattan. It was only a subway ride away from the Bronx. But as Sonia wrote later, it seemed like a whole different world. After that first date, Sonia and Kevin became a couple. He spent as much time as he could at Sonia's house. Sonia had other good friends at school too. Ken Moy was a year older than Sonia. She met him when she joined a club where students had to make speeches. Ken coached her on how to speak in front of an audience. Sonia knew that would help her become a lawyer, just like Perry Mason. All through high school, Sonia studied hard. She also worked at Prospect Hospital. Junior worked as well. He had 2 jobs. They both had to help out because the family was so poor. With so little money, Sonia wasn't sure how she would ever pay for college. Then one day, when Sonia was a senior, her friend Ken Moy called. Ken was now at Princeton University. Princeton was in the Ivy League, a small group of top schools in the country. Ken gave Sonia some advice. "Try for the Ivy League," he said. It might be hard for Sonia to fit in, especially being poor and Hispanic. But he said an Ivy League education would change her life forever. Sonia decided to take Ken's advice. She applied to the 3 Ivy League schools: Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. She had no idea how tough it was to get into these schools. But guess what? She was accepted at all 3. After visiting each, Sonia decided to follow in Ken Moy's footsteps. She would go to Princeton. The college was in New Jersey, only about an hour and a half from New York City. But for Sonia, Princeton was completely new and different, like nowhere she'd ever been before. Chapter 3, Princeton. At Princeton, many of the students came from rich families. Most were white. By college, many had traveled all over the world. They went skiing, owned fancy cars, and wore expensive clothes. They felt right at home on the beautiful college campus, with its fancy wood-paneled dining halls and old stone buildings. But Princeton wanted more students from different backgrounds. They were trying to bring in smart, hardworking students like Sonia Sotomayor. It was part of a program called Affirmative Action. Affirmative action, how about? Affirmative action. Affirmative action is a program that helps minorities get ahead in school and find work. It started in the United States in the 1960s. It was a way to make up for racial discrimination. If 2 people apply for a job, most of the time the white person would be chosen over the black one. Affirmative action tried to change that. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy signed a law that required anyone working for the government to take positive action, affirmative action, to make sure minorities could get government jobs. When minorities applied for a job or applied for college, they were given extra consideration because they were in a minority. That way, people who had not been as lucky growing up were given a better chance to succeed. Princeton gave Sonia full scholarship. That meant she didn't have to pay for school. Without the scholarship, she would never have afforded to be at Princeton. She could never have afforded to be at Princeton. She has said many times over the years that she was grateful for affirmative action. It helped her get into a top school and achieve her dreams. Soon enough, Sonia had a group of friends. Her roommate, Dolores, was Mexican American. They hung out together on the campus on the Third World Center. It was a center for minority students. Most of the people Sonia met there were interested in politics and justice. They wanted to make the world a better place. Years later, First Lady Michelle Obama would go to Princeton. She spent much of her time at the Third World Center, too. Sonia didn't get good grades at first. To her surprise, she got a C on her first paper she wrote for a history class. So she did what she had done before. She asked for help. Her professor explained how to write more clearly and put forth a convincing argument on paper. Other professors helped too. They told her that she was mixing Spanish grammar into English sentences. So, in the summer, after her freshman year, Sonia bought some English grammar books. She studied them hard. After that, her grades improved. Meanwhile, Sonia and Kevin were still a couple. Kevin had gone off to a different college. He came to visit Sonia on weekends. Even though she was getting good grades now, Sonia didn't always feel like she fit in. It was hard being only one of only a handful of Hispanics on campus. Feeling like an outsider made Sonia determined to change things at Princeton. One thing Sonia noticed was that Princeton had no Hispanic professors. Not one. Even the Spanish classes weren't taught by Hispanic people. She and her friends from the Third World Center wrote letters to the people in charge of Princeton. Then she wrote to the U.S. government. She sent in a complaint. Her complaint was that Princeton was being unfair to minorities. It worked. After that, Princeton hired a Hispanic person for an important job as Assistant Dean of Student Affairs. By the time Sonia was ready to graduate, she was known as a leader, someone who took charge. And her grades were excellent. Yet, as graduation grew closer, Sonia realized she still had a lot to learn. One day, Sonia walked into her dorm room. As she explained years later in the book about her life, Sonia found her friend Felice sitting there. Felice looked embarrassed. She had seen a letter in Sonia's wastebasket. It was an invitation to join a very special club. I knew I pronounced that name wrong. Felice looked embarrassed. She had seen the letter in Sonia's wastebasket. It was an invitation to join a very special club called Phi Beta Kappa. Phi Beta Kappa. The club was for the very top students. At Princeton, that meant the best of the best. Sonia had thrown the letter away because she had never heard of Phi Beta Kappa. Sonia took Felice's advice. She answered the invitation and got a Phi Beta Kappa key, a symbol of the club's honor. In June of 1976, Sonia graduated from Princeton. Besides Phi Beta Kappa, she received other honors as well. She was the crown winner of the Pine. She was the co-winner of the Pine Prize, the highest award a senior at Princeton could receive. Finishing college was really just the start of her education. However, Sonia realized she would keep on learning for the rest of her life. Chapter 4, Law and Marriage. Everyone in Sotomayor family expected Sonia and Kevin to get married. Sonia and Kevin expected it too. They had been sweethearts since high school, after all. So in the summer after college graduation, they planned their wedding. This was the right time in the fall. Sonia would be starting law school at Yale. Her childhood dream of becoming a lawyer was going to come true. The wedding was held on August 14th, 1976, at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. St. Patrick's is a huge, beautiful church on Fifth Avenue. How did Sonia and Kevin get married in such a fancy place? Junior, her brother, worked for the church. After the wedding, Sonia and Kevin moved to New Haven, Connecticut. That's where Yale Law School is. For the next 3 years, Sonia studied law. Kevin got a job in a science lab. Sonia worked part-time jobs too. One of her jobs was as a bouncer in a campus bar. Sonia had to make sure everyone was old enough and no one came in without paying. She was strict about the rules. Law school was hard, harder than Sonia had expected. She had to study all the time. Once again, she felt she had to prove herself, just like at Princeton. There weren't many Latino students or other minorities. Affirmative action had helped Sonia get into Yale Law School. At Yale Law School, Latino people held some important jobs. In her first year there, Sonia met Jose Cabranes. He was a legend to many Puerto Ricans. Once, he had been a lawyer for the governor of Puerto Rico. Now he worked at Yale as their top lawyer. Quickly, Cabranes became a mentor to Sonia, a person who gave her advice and helped her career. Sonia worked part-time for Cabranes. She also learned a lot just by watching him. Sonia saw how he spoke and acted in front of people. He was smart, kind, and generous. He also cared deeply about the things he believed in, like future of Puerto Rico. Cabranes was a Hispanic person from a poor background who was treated with a huge amount of respect. For Sonia, law school was a lot like Princeton. She started out slowly, not sure of herself. At first, she never raised her hand in class. But by her final year at law school, she was doing well. She wrote an article for the Yale Law Journal. It was printed. Only the best students had articles in the journal. In October 1978, Sonia and other students were invited to have dinner with lawyers from a big law firm in Washington, D.C. The law firm was looking to hire Yale grads. Sonia understood that the dinner was like a job interview. If the lawyers were impressed with her, she might be offered the job. But the dinner didn't go well. The man sitting across from Sonia was one of the heads of the law firm. The very first words out of his mouth were about affirmative action. Did Sonia get into Yale because she was Puerto Rican? Yes, Sonia said. She was grateful that Yale Law School wanted more students of color. Being Latina had helped her get accepted. The man thought it was a big problem. He said law firms shouldn't hire affirmative action students. Why? Because they'd just end up firing them a few years later. Sonia was shocked. The man assumed she wasn't as good as the other Yale students. He'd actually said so to her face. Sonia never took things lying down. She was a fighter. She made a formal complaint to Yale. She said Yale shouldn't allow that law firm to interview law students on campus, not if they were going to treat Hispanics unfairly. Eventually, the law firm apologized, but they didn't offer Sonia a job. She didn't want to work for them anyway. Well, now what? Sonia wondered. She would be graduating from law school soon, but she had no job offers. Then one night in the new library, she spotted a room full of people. Cheese and crackers were being served. Sonia was hungry, so she went in. She also wanted to find out what was going on. That's when she met the person who could offer her the perfect job. The job she had been dreaming about since childhood. Chapter 5, Catching the Bad Guys.